From beautiful East Tennessee in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains, you are listening to the Sherry Voluntary Show, and I thank you for spending your time with us today. I have a co-host today, which normally I don't, the handsome Michael Clark.
Hello, hello.
And he is a technical writer, the editor for Recuro.org, and you also do a little writing yourself. I know because I read your article on North Korea and the Hawaiian scare that happened. I loved that. It was a great article. And you are also an immigrant from, as our friend Alan Mosley from the Gold Standard podcast would put it, Northern Wrong America.
Yep. I.e. Canada.
Yeah. We don't say that word. Sorry, that's the C word in this house. And you are also the caretaker of a fantastic beard. I think people can
I'm working
see
on
that.
it.
Yeah.
I'm working on it.
It's pretty magnificent.
I think our guest, though, is going to
he's probably gonna outdo you on that aspect. So I did want to mention that yesterday was the birth date of a very famous right American, and that was Patrick Henry.
Oh, well, he was pretty good.
Yeah. So May 29th in 1736. Few minutes ago, just a little bit ago. And he was known as the voice of the revolution. He was a Virginian lawyer and an anti-federalist, which, you know, they kind of have a special place in my heart, the anti-federalists. And of course, people know his most famous quote, "I know not what others may choose, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Like that's the really famous from the speech that he gave. And also there's another quote of his that I really like. That's "the great object is that every man be armed." I kind of like that too.
I can get on board with that.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I just think it's important to remember and sort of honor these dissidents and civil disruptors and criminals that started this country because, you know, all of the law-abiding citizens seem to have a strange idea, a strange view of how we should and why we should obey laws these days. So I like to just give a reminder that, you know, the founders of this country, the people that started it, weren't necessarily law-abiding citizens.
They're radicals.
Yeah, radicals. Oh, love that word. All right. So are you ready to get in with our guests today?
Please.
Yeah, please.
Please.
You'd like some?
Now.
So our guest tonight is Mr. Kyle Anzalone, and he is the host of Foreign Policy Focus podcast. He's also the editor-in-chief at immersionnews.com, and he writes the daily news roundup at Libertarian Institute, and you also have been published on Consortium News. And so welcome to the show, Kyle.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, it's great to have you. You know, I haven't really done a show yet on foreign policy in particular, so it's going to be really good to kind of get into that because that's not something that I generally talk about too much, unless I'm talking about, you know, a war or something in particular. But I wanted to have you on to sort of talk about Israel and kind of give a very bird's eye view of that whole conflict, because I know you could do 20 shows on the whole deal in the Middle East and you still wouldn't cover it all. So for me, I've always just kind of wanted to understand that a little bit better. So we'll just consider this an introductory step in that direction. But before we do that, I want to just get a little bit about you and your background and how you got into, you know, being a foreign policy expert.
Well, I don't know about expert, but I do read a lot of news on the subject, and I have a podcast where I talk about it. You know, I kind of found Ron Paul in 2010, 2011, I guess. I was in college, so fortunately I had a lot of time to just sit and YouTube Ron Paul, Judge Napolitano, and Tom Woods all day long.
The libertarian trinity.
Right. And eventually, you know, I got out of college and I had a job where I was driving around a lot, and I was listening to the Peter Schiff show one day, and then suddenly a guy named Tom Woods, you know, now has his own podcast. I'm listening to that, and through that I discovered Scott Horton and the Scott Horton Show, which was just phenomenal covering all these issues.
Yeah.
I had, paid attention to the news enough. So when, I was listening to Scott and he was explaining, what's going on in Iraq right now, what's going on in Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, I remembered. I was like, oh yeah, I heard all these lies before. And now he's explaining what's going on now and how everything that, all the naysayers were talking about back, in 07 or whatever, when I was, supporting John McCain and just, terrible on all the issues, were right. Absolutely. And so, I started paying attention to him or reading journalists like Gareth Porter and Patrick Coburn, checking antiwar.com, LouRockwell.com. And suddenly, you start to get all these facts that actually made sense about the war issues. Mm-hmm. And that was a big difference. So if you listen to like Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow every night, when they do get around to talking about the wars, it never makes any sense. Because, in one case we're, supporting one faction, the next case, we're supporting their opposing faction, and we're doing all these counterproductive things to our stated mission to fight the terror war. And so whenever you listen to and read all these other guys, then you suddenly start to get the real picture. And you're like, oh, this does make sense, and it's actually pretty comprehensible.
Yeah. And one of the things is that with, like, say, a Hannity or Rachel Maddow, you're always going to get the view according to who's in the White House. So it's always skewed by and biased towards, whether they hate the president or love the president. So they don't really give you any insight into why things are actually being done. It's just more apologism for whoever it is, whether they're Republican or Democrat. So that's what's really despicable about the state of the way Americans view foreign policy. I think in a lot of ways it has to do with their team, whoever's in there, and they've got to back that person up, regardless of whether they're right or not, or whether it's actually in the best interest of this country. So it's pretty deplorable.
I saw a screenshot of Sean Hannity saying something about Obama and how Obama's playing golf while we're bombing Syria or something. It had something to do with it. But now Trump is doing exactly the same thing, and crickets.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they never say anything.
Right. So, I think James Comey is probably the best example of this. I remember this was eye-opening to me during the 2016 election when he came out and, said, we're not going to press charges against Hillary Clinton. And then all the Republicans say he was the worst person in the world, and the Democrats are talking about how qualified he was. And then he reopened the investigation, and everybody flipped. Like nobody remembered yesterday. It was one of the most incredible things I've ever seen. And to me, that that was just one of those experiences where you go, oh, okay, I see how it works here. Like it is just that big of a con.
Yeah, no intellectual honesty, none. To get into the Israel issue just a little bit, on May 14th, the state of Israel celebrated its 70th year, and it wouldn't be a birthday, but a year. So since that time, there's been a lot of turmoil in the Middle East, and I guess I'd want to first talk about how the U.S. is connected to that. That relationship between the U.S. and Israel, and then Israel and, say, Palestine and the rest of the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, this is the perfect day to talk about because May 14th was the 70th anniversary of the founding of Israel. And I think more importantly, it was a 70th anniversary of what the Palestinians call Nakba Day, which in English means catastrophe day. And this was the day that the Israeli, what I guess would be the Israeli militias, although it wasn't an Israeli state yet, formed their country and then drove the Palestinians out of the, viable land of Israel. And then forced them and create the first couple 100,000 Palestinian refugees. And ever since, it's been kind of a slow process. But on that day, we had the United States open the embassy in Jerusalem. And this was important because Jerusalem was supposed to be the shared capital of Israel and Palestine. And a lot of people interpret this as the United States finally taking the two-state solution off the table, saying that the Palestinians will not have their own state because, their would-be capital is now recognized, by the U.S. more or less as the capital of Israel. And so, that's another problem. And then the Palestinians, especially those in Gaza, live terrible lives. And I don't, mean to say that because there's anything wrong with the Palestinians, but they're completely blockaded. The Egyptians blocked some of their borders. The Israelis blocked the rest. They board the Mediterranean Sea, but are only allowed to fish a couple kilometers off the coast. And other than that, the Israeli, warships turn them back. They have 4 hours of power a day. The Gaza Strip has been bombed, and yet they're not allowed to import concrete to rebuild their buildings. They're not allowed to import wheelchairs. I could go on, but I think that's, enough to show that, why these people live terrible lives. And so they started to approach every Friday for the 6 weeks leading up to Nakba Day or Catastrophe Day, the border fence, and the Israeli snipers open fire. Well, on Nakba Day, Catastrophe Day, there were large protests, and people really got up close to the fence and I guess were pulling on it. And at that point, the Israeli snipers just opened fire and started mowing people down. Over 60 killed, thousands injured, and I think nearly 1,000 by live fire.
Wow. It's hard to understand that kind of oppression. Like we've not seen that here in our lifetimes. And I heard someone else explain it as, they don't need to put all the Palestinians in a prison because they live in one, basically. they are locked down and they can be killed at any moment. And that there are actually rallies for these soldiers that just shoot some guy walking around because he looked at them wrong or whatever. That if they get any punishment at all, it's usually a slap on the wrist. And if they even get that, then there are like riots by Israelis about it that are calling for death to Arabs and all sort of really terrible things. So it just makes you wonder, like, what was the vision originally of Israel when they decided to make a state? Like, why has it become what it is? Surely they didn't intend to go in and make enemies. I don't understand why it's gotten to this point.
Actually, Kyle, one step backwards from that, you said that when the state was created, right before it was official, that the militias were driving the Palestinians out. While that was happening, what was the U.S. or Britain or any of the other countries saying about that? Were they just turning a blind eye? Because it seems like this kind of behavior that Sherry was just talking about that's been the case like since before day one.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first place to start is this is, 1948 and prior. And so, there's no cell phones, there's no cameras. And I think the Palestinians were largely considered to be non-existent. Like people thought that the state of Israel was being put in the Israelis' ancient homeland that had been vacant prior to that. There's a recent episode of the Scott Horton Show with Eric Margulies, and maybe we could link to in the show notes page. I'll send you the link after. And Eric Margulies is discussing how his mother was the one who went over there and found the Palestinian people. And I think he used the word discovered. And I think that was pretty accurate, that nobody knew they were there. And so that was part of it. I'm sure that part of it was that there was UN resolutions, and I can't remember the exact number of the UN resolution, but a lot of people know it. But that basically, gave the authorization to create the state of Israel. And again, kind of assuming that there was nobody there in the first place, yet there were Palestinians who had lived there for thousands of years. And, just because the land was taken from, whoever 2,000 years ago, doesn't mean you could take it from other people today. But that's been kind of the point there. I will recommend a couple things for people who want to do deep dives on the issue. The episode of Free Man Beyond the Wall, number 85, with Jeremy Hammond as the guest. It's 2 hours long. It's long, but I mean, really goes through all the little details leading up to the Nakba and then after. And then an episode of my show, 194, and it's titled Catastrophe Day, and Will Porter's the guest. And Will Porter kind of goes through what led up to the Nakba. And then we talk a little bit about kind of the current protests and stuff going on.
Hey, Kyle, when we're talking about Palestinians, is that a racial designation, or is that a nationalistic one, or what does that word actually mean?
Yeah, I believe the Palestinians are Arab, and it would probably be like cultural designation.
Okay.
And now they look to establish their own nation, but there are people with their own distinct culture. I mean, now there's millions of Palestinians living abroad as refugees. I think like close to half the Jordanian population is actually Palestinian refugees. But even now, from people that I've read, like Ramzi Baroud, who is a Palestinian himself from Gaza, has described that they've held on to their own culture.
Now, were they sort of the people left behind as the others were being driven out when the takeover, for lack of a better word, when the war happened? Were these Palestinians people who were just left behind after that, or?
Yeah, well, some of them. I mean, many of these refugees have been born into a refugee status. Remember this is 1948, and so during that time, people have had kids and grandkids, and now many of the people I would assume are the grandkids or even great grandkids coming on now of the original refugees. Some of those people ended up in the Gaza Strip. There's 2 million people there living now, but 80% of those are refugees from other areas of Palestine. Very few are actually, were from Gaza City or one of the other cities in that territory. There's also the West Bank, where there's, again, some native inhabitants and then a good number of refugees. There's hundreds of thousands of refugees, at least in Syria, and then more in Lebanon, Egypt, and like I mentioned before, Jordan.
You mentioned that the border to Egypt that's blocked. Is that what you said? And
Yep.
how do the Egyptians look at the Palestinians?
Well, right now, the person in charge of Egypt is General al-Sisi, and he seized power after the Arab Spring in Egypt. There's popular elections. The Muslim Brotherhood won. I believe that was Mubarak. I hope I got that name right. Won, and then he was pretty promptly by the United States, kicked out in a military coup. Al-Sisi took over. Since he's rounded up, they just had the recent Egyptian elections, and I think he won like 98% of his vote and had arrested like his next 11 competitors or something absurd like that. So this guy is just a U.S. sock puppet, and for a long time the Egypts have kind of taken the word of the Americans. And excuse me, that wasn't Mubarak. That was Mohammed Morsi. Was a more recent leader of Egypt, who was Muslim Brotherhood, who was kicked out of power. But the Egyptians control that border, and while they don't control a whole lot of the Sinai Peninsula, and there's militant groups that run around, they do keep that border on lockdown. And I'm sure it's less of an issue for the Egyptian citizens and more of an issue for the United States and Israel. And of course, the United States gives Egypt a lot of military aid. I think the second or third most after Israel and maybe Pakistan.
Mm. Well, it kind of brings us to, how the U.S. sort of turns a blind eye often beyond reason. Like people are going, why do we turn a blind eye to what Israel is doing, or we support them in doing certain things that I don't think most of the American people support? Pardon me. So how did the United States become an ally, such a close ally of Israel? Is it purely religious in nature, or like some kind of, religious connection, or is there more to that? So how did that kind of come about?
Yeah, I mean, I guess kind of from the start, it was a Western government project. I think the UK was initially in charge of the territory, and they kind of handed it off to the United Nations. And so from the start, Israel has been a UN-ish project. Now, I think a lot of it has had to do with there's an awful lot of influence in America that lobbies for Israel. The Israel lobby is a very powerful thing. Israel has since made itself a very wealthy state, and this means that they're able to buy a lot of American weapons, and that's part of how you buy influence in this country, is by buying weapons. Look at Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Right now, those countries are getting the United States to buy into a war in Yemen that provides absolutely no benefit for the Americans, yet we're doing it because they'll spend billions of dollars on weapons. Yeah. So there's a lot of places you get the power and influence from, and I'm sure over time there's been various political interests that are made probably on pretty small levels. Like I have a lot of Jewish people in my district, so I'm gonna say I'm gonna run to support the state of Israel, and they're gonna vote for me and stuff like that.
Does the U.S. government subsidize the weapons purchases?
$3.6 billion a year. And I think under Obama, they agreed to they agreed to take we're going to give Israel $3.6 billion a year for the next 10 years. And I think the Israelis initially rejected that and asked for more money. That's not good enough. Give us more.
Wow, it's pretty amazing. Just keep that military industrial complex going. Back in my neocon days, I used to think that was like a conspiracy theory. The military industrial complex. Yeah. What does that mean? But the more if you just look at it, you see it. It's not hard. They don't hide it. It's pretty it's pretty clear, I guess, if you're paying any attention at all. It's just a matter of paying attention and seeing that maybe things aren't done for the reasons that politicians tell you they're done for. Speaking of politicians, so Benjamin Netanyahu is, he's really a towering figure in Israeli politics, and he's like this is the fourth time he's been elected as prime minister, and he has a lot of influence and a lot of friends in the United States government. One being Joe Biden, Mitt Romney, and then he knows Trump very well from many years. He knew his father back in the 80s in New York. What effect does that have on U.S. policy with Israel? And have those policies sort of shifted the way Israel looks at, say, Palestine? Has that shifted pre-Netanyahu to post-Netanyahu or during his tenure?
Yeah, I mean, I think it had, at least under Trump, it definitely seems like the Israeli government is more hawkish. And I'm sure part of, the Israeli policy has a lot to do with how the international community is viewing what Israel is doing. Because Israel is such a small state that in the past, at least, was surrounded by a lot of hostile neighbors, not quite so much anymore with Syria and chaos and the Jordan government and the Egyptian government being more or less sock puppets of the United States. And now Israel seems to have a pretty decent relationship with the Arab states of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And I'm sure part of this was fueled by the United States. And just while we're talking about connections to the Trump campaign in Israel, I think the big one is Jared Kushner, whose family actually funded settlement projects in East Jerusalem where, they kick Palestinians off of their land or out of their homes. Or, sometimes, they just take the home, put on new lots and give some Israeli citizens the key. Yeah. It could be that bad. But certainly Netanyahu has been a pretty hawkish Israel leader. Now, I have heard some people argue that, well, as hawkish as Netanyahu is and as terrible as what he's doing is, there's some really scary people in Israeli politics who may be a whole lot worse. Wow. And so, you look at what warhawk Barack Obama was, but then you remember the alternative was, John McCain, and the same thing with Donald Trump, realizing the alternative was Hillary Clinton. So, maybe it could have been worse. But like I said, I think a lot of it depends on, how much pressure the international community is putting on Israel and how much the United States and the UK will really stand up and defend Israel at the UN. The US and UK hold very important positions at the UN, being permanent members of the Security Council, meaning that they could veto any resolution brought before the Security Council. And those are the ones with, real teeth as far as the UN goes. And, so the U.S. and UK have really been able to make sure that nothing bad happens to Israel at the UN. But towards the end of Obama's administration, he actually was standing up and saying that we're not going to veto this resolution. I think it would, condemn and in no way really punish Israel for some of the settlement expansions. And in fact, if there's any real truth to Russiagate, it's that Michael Flynn lobbied the Russian ambassador to get the Russians to veto that resolution on behalf of Donald Trump in the United States because Barack Obama wasn't doing it. Yet nobody wants to talk about that portion of Russiagate.
Wow. It's also convoluted and so many layers to understanding what's really going on that it's kind of some of those things that I look at and I go, ugh, it's just, there's so much. I almost don't want to get too deep into it because there are just so many moving parts and so many sort of incestuous relationships, and we hate each other here and we love each other there, and all the different countries. It's just a lot to take in, and I think maybe it's that way almost by design. There's so much. Did you have another question with that?
Well, I was just wondering, talking about Netanyahu, the first world leaders, do you think that there's a big effect of their personal relationships among each other when it comes to policy in general? So in other words, if, I don't know, is Netanyahu close to Trump at all? Or Obama?
I mean, he speaks English. He speaks English well. If anybody just wants to look up to the addresses that gives to Congress, even compared to like French President Macron, you could really understand Netanyahu, and he sounds good. And I think he knows all the right people. And I'm sure there's a lot of elitism that goes into it. I'm not sure how important that is with Israel in particular, but I just had Scott Horton on my show on today's episode. That was actually Foreign Policy Focus number 200. So that was awesome. But he kind of explained how one of the reasons that Mohammed al-Sadr, who's an Iraqi cleric, really wasn't supported by the U.S. was because, well, he was seen as a low ranking, because cleric isn't all that high as far as religious leader in Islam goes. And, there's other guys that wear these really nice fancy robes and, really know how to schmooze and stuff like that. And it does really seem to make a difference with these elites. And if you look at who Donald Trump is and how he changes his mind all the time, you would think that somebody who's able to speak his language, literally, and, presents themselves well and, knows how to point out the pretty girls to Donald Trump or something like that would definitely be something that would make Trump warm up to somebody and more or less take their side on an issue.
Yeah. So speaking in terms of, religion, I know that Netanyahu is close to the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, and the Italian Prime Minister, Silvio Berlusconi. And those are both sort of traditionally Christian nations. And Mike's father is from Hungary and he's Catholic. And of course, the Italians are mainly Catholic. So my question to you would be, how do those countries that are not historically Christian or mostly Christian, say China or India, how do they view Israel and that, our relationship with them?
So I can't speak to Hungary or Italy in particular. I'm just unaware, but that's interesting that he would be close to those leaders just because those leaders are somewhat on the outs with like the rest of the European consensus. At least as far as what I've been able to read and see, just at the UN in general, Russia has a pretty decent relationship with Israel actually, and there was a time when Israel carried out some airstrikes on Syria, and Netanyahu told him to knock it off, Putin told Netanyahu to knock it off for a couple months, and he actually did, and so there is some influence there, and there are a lot of former Eastern Europe Jewish people who have since relocated to Israel and lived there. And so I think there's probably a lot of influence that way. I don't think China has any particular love for Israel or, doesn't have a deep-seated hatred. It's not, it's not like they're the Iranians. There's nobody chanting in Beijing death to Israel. But at the same time, these are the other countries that stand up to Israel. And if you look at the General Assembly UN votes, which generally don't have any teeth to them, but at the same time, you could get a consensus of where other nations stand. Israel does lose those votes at the UN, and more or less the other countries of the world really don't favor or have any particular love for what the Israelis are doing, especially because of how they're doing it to the Palestinians and how terribly the Palestinian people are treated.
Yeah.
Is there any real practical effect of what the UN does in this situation? I mean, is the UN all talk, or do they actually do things that have a tangible effect?
I guess it depends on how much people listen. It's it's a government body in a lot of ways. And so, there's no secret government, juice that actually makes people follow the orders, but people generally follow the orders of the UN. And so if the UN were to say put sanctions on Israel, then I'm guessing the United States wouldn't listen to that, but the other countries of the world would. And so that could have a pretty devastating effect on the Israeli economy if, we're able to go down that road. I mean, there are some effects that the UN will be able to have. Also, I mean, this is, there's always politics involved in UN investigations, but I know they have been pushing for the UN to investigate the Israelis shooting all those Gazans protesting. So, I mean, there are things the UN could do, but nothing's a solution. The UN can't say Israel will now accept the Palestinians as citizens of the Israeli state, treat them just like they would any single Jewish person in Israel, and they're all going to live in peace and harmony together. The UN can't enforce that.
Right. So this is probably just more of an opinion. You're asking your opinion, but do you think that the state of Israel is trying to sort of build a proxy empire with, U.S. power?
I think the Israeli goal is probably to take all of, what is Israel now, including the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and confirm their hold over the Golan Heights, which is territory, Syrian territory that's been occupied by Israel, maybe some of southern Lebanon, and expand a little bit more into Syria. But I don't think they're looking to have any kind of other empire ambitions. I think they're just looking to have their kind of expanded Israeli state.
Okay. Why do they want to expand into those areas? Just to have more of a foothold strategically for military reasons, or?
Yeah, the Golan Heights is a strategic region. It's kind of up on a plateau, and I think it's a pretty strategic region overlooking the capital city of Syria, Damascus. A lot of it, I'm guessing, has to do with water rights. There's a lot of kind of aquifers underground and rivers and stuff, and this is a pretty arid land. And I think Israel's even tried to convert a large portion of desert into a forest, and so they're in need of water, and expanding a little bit would give them that water. Also, kicking the people who currently live there out is another goal of the Israelis. They seem to want to have their Jewish state, which is, a Jewish supermajority that could vote, for a Jewish leader if they want. And accepting the Palestinians who currently live in Israel would make it nearly a 50-50 vote. And that's just not sustainable, especially because the Palestinians tend to have children at a higher rate than the Israelis. And if people start coming back from other countries, then you're going to have a problem where maybe the Jewish people of Israel are a minority, and then there's a popularly elected Palestinian leader, and that's completely unacceptable. So those are my general reasons for why Israel's looking for that territory.
In terms of their way of life right now, you said earlier that they only get 4 hours of electricity a day.
The people of Gaza. Now,
okay.
there's kind of two sections of Palestine. One is the Gaza Strip, which borders Egypt and the Mediterranean Sea, and the other is the West Bank, which is pretty fractured in itself. If you look at the 67 map, it almost looks like a backwards B. That's a pretty large section of would that be northeast Israel? However, the Israelis have kind of colonized more and more of that land, and some chunks of that land are more or less broken off from the rest of the West Bank now. And even those people who live in the West Bank where it's not broken off, there's settler only roads, so the Palestinian people can't even travel on those roads. But the people in the West Bank, do have some freedom. They could travel. There's just more wealth there. Whereas, I said before, the people of Gaza, 2 million people, 80% refugees, completely blockaded. WikiLeaks actually revealed that the Israelis limit the amount of food that the Gazans could have so that they're starving, but they're not starving, but they're at the same time not able to thrive. So they count the calories of the Palestinian people living in Gaza. And, those people are the ones that have been described as living in an open air prison.
Is there humanitarian aid coming in from any other place to address that immediate problem?
So there's been what they called flotillas in the past that have tried, basically just, civilians on ships with white flags saying, hey, that we see some people here, they're suffering, we're going to sail our ship in and, let us go. One of those ships was a Turkish ship, and the Israeli forces actually, jumped down onto the ship, I think killed a couple people and prevented them from bringing wheelchairs into Gaza. There's currently a flotilla that I believe just left like Sweden or Denmark and is headed around UK and Spain the long way and then through the Mediterranean Sea. I guess it's probably making stops at a bunch of ports trying to raise money for the Palestinians, but they say they're going to try to land in Gaza. I know right now the Israelis are erecting like basically a sea barrier where the Gaza border meets with the Israeli border. So maybe they're going to try to expand that barrier all the way around Gaza. That way they don't have to like shoot and kill all the people trying to bring in aid, but they're willing to if that's what they have to do.
It's deplorable. And it's deplorable to think that so many, especially, the Christians in our country would support this kind of thing. I think it just speaks to their utter lack of just understanding, and I just feel like a lot of times they don't want to understand what's going on. They just see Israel, they see that word, and they say we have to support them, and there's no discussion other than that. So it's almost like the Back the Blue crowd or the pro-military crowd, that you can't have any criticism of Israel, or you just you hate the Jews. So I don't see how we get past that in this country to kind of quit funding all that, because I think if we maybe cut off some of our support, Israel would have a lot harder time doing these things. I mean, it seems to be no doubt about that. Is there a solution?
Well, I mean, everybody does seem okay with just kind of accepting the narrative that, well, there's Arabs there, Islamic Arabs, and then there's Jews, and they kill each other, and that's what Jews and Muslims do. Mm-hmm. And that's, just kind of, that's as much as they want to get into it. But, I was just talking with my friend today who's writing a pretty good article on Iran, and we were kind of talking about how everybody says that, oh, the Iranians hate Israel because Israel is Jewish people, when that's not all the case, at least, and that is that the Iranians care about the people, the Palestinians, and that's why they hate the state of Israel, because the state of Israel is killing and oppressing and occupying Palestinian lands. And if you want proof of this, there's 25,000 Jews living in Iran. So why would Iran try to go to the far side of the Middle East to pick on America's favorite ally to kill some Jews when there's 25,000 Jews living in Iran, if that's really the goal of the Ayatollah and the IRGC? And that's actually, next to Israel, the next largest Jewish population in the entire Middle East. So, while everybody likes to pretend that the narrative is that, this is a war between religions, it's just not the case. There's oppressed people in this situation. The Gazans are the clear victims, the people of Palestine, excuse me. And, you could look back historically and you could say, well, 2,000 years ago, this happened, 1,500 years ago, this happened, 60 years ago, this happened, 30 years ago, this happened. But if you look at the situation today, it's, when there was a good story here. Is an Israeli soldier had gotten into a skirmish with a Palestinian who was trying to kill him, shot and incapacitated the Palestinian, and then as the man was laying on the ground, not moving, not threatening anyone, went up and shot him in the head. That soldier ended up doing 8 months in prison. Wow. There's a young Palestinian girl named Ahed Tamimi who was 16 years old, spent her whole life growing up under occupation, slapped an Israeli soldier, was taken from her home in the middle of the night, interrogated without her parents for hours on end, including some interrogation that definitely shouldn't have happened to a 16-year-old. You had members of the Israeli parliament suggesting that they should turn off the cameras and send a couple men in there, seemingly suggesting that they should rape a minor. She eventually agreed to a plea deal and will do 9 months in jail. So she'll do a month more than somebody who executed an unarmed man.
How do the Israelis justify all this? I mean, maybe not any individual incident, but in general, their response would be, well, look, they're doing X, Y, Z. We have to be kind of ruthless here. What are the Israelis saying?
Yeah, I think it's the same thing you hear in the U.S., which is but Hamas. Anytime you say anything, they're like, but Hamas. And in fact, after the Catastrophe Day protests where 60 Palestinians died and over 1,000 were injured, and not a single Israeli soldier was even injured, not even a scratch on a single Israeli soldier. The only thing of Israel that was even damaged was the fence keeping the Palestinians in their jail. And the White House comes out and says, well, this was a propaganda stunt by Hamas. How that could possibly be the case makes no sense. I mean, if, this was actually an attack on Israel, wouldn't somebody at least have gotten injured? Not that I want anybody to get injured or die on either side, but when the numbers are, 60 killed and 1,000 wounded to 0 killed and 0 wounded, you can't really call that an attack or a clash or anything like that. It was just a massacre. And when it comes to like the situation in Israel, I've read a lot of people talk about this idea called Hezbollah, which is basically just like this open, known conception that the Palestinians are evil, and if we let them out, they're going to hurt the Jewish people of Israel. And Hamas has done some things in the past that certainly don't help fight against this narrative, like the knife intifada, which is where Palestinian people are just going up and stabbing Jews. That kind of stuff is completely unacceptable, and I don't endorse it. But at the same time, you can't collectively punish a whole group of people just because a couple of those people do a bad thing. And you have to remember that this is blowback too, right? That these are people who grew up in oppression. The last election in Gaza was in 2006. And right now, 51% of the 2 million people living there are under the age of 18 years old and had no right to vote in an election that was 12 years ago. And so you're telling me that those million plus people deserve to suffer because of an election that happened, before, half of them were probably in diapers, right?
Yeah, it's really despicable, and it reminds me sort of what people have, our own government, the U.S. government has admitted that they know there are people who are innocent in Gitmo, in Guantanamo, but they can't let them out anymore because our own treatment of them has radicalized them. And it's sort of the same thing with the people of Palestine. That is going around and stabbing people just at random is an act of desperate people. Like, they have no other way of getting back at this state that is oppressing them severely. Like, we're not talking about just they don't have the same equality that Israelis do. They are actually oppressed and they're suffering. And so as a woman, to hear them talk about maybe we should send 2 men in there to rape this young girl, it's just that kind of mindset it just tells you that these people are not human to them. You wouldn't treat a dog that way. So I just can't imagine viewing other humans like that. It's quite disturbing. I really have to say, it's almost unbelievable.
Right. I mean, when you look at it, this last round of protesting to me has kind of made the conclusion firm that they have to portray the Palestinians as rabid dogs who, if they exit their, little pent up fence, they are just going to go out and unleash hell on whoever they get to first, because they're, unrationally angry and mad and terrible. Yeah. And that's what they're going to do. And that's simply not the case. I mean, even now, most of these people going and, the ones they say are carrying out violence against Israel are, tying ropes to fences and trying to pull, the wall of their prison down. They're throwing rots at the, snipers who are, 2 fences away from them. There's no way that, they're hitting any of the snipers who are in elevated positions on top of hills. You see videos of 14-year-old looking kids, I can't tell exactly how old he is, holding a rock that's smaller than his fist, throwing it at a fence that's 50 meters away from him. And then he takes a bullet in the eye and, that's the end of his life. And just, to get to your point on the hopelessness of the Palestinian people, I read a press release from Doctors Without Borders, and as I was talking about, there are 6 weeks of these protests, and they were saying that we'll have a young man come in who was shot in the leg, and the Israelis are using something called butterfly bullets, which I guess are longer and kind of like in a hollow point style, like peel out, and they're they sever and cause amputations. And of course, even if these are completely innocent protesters, some of them even medics or something like that, Israel is denying them permission to leave Gaza to seek treatment at a better hospital, because all the hospitals hospitals in Gaza just don't have the equipment that that they need to perform surgeries needed to save limbs. So lots of people are facing amputations, and then they'll tell them, that I'm going back next week to the next protest, and they say, why? And, if they kill me, they kill me. What kind of life do I have? There's 50% unemployment in Gaza. These people see no hope, and that's because they're they're not even allowed to import. Yeah. Right. So what can you hope for other than maybe your death is the one that wakes the world up to the fact that 2 million people are suffering? And as Will Porter pointed out, I believe by 2020, Gaza, by the UN estimation, is going to be inhospitable. The Israelis don't allow them to import, chemicals to treat their water. And so a lot of their water is now bad. Like I said, they don't have any infrastructure. Israel continues to bomb there. And what happens then? When it's inhospitable, people start to succumb to, just all kinds of death, deprivation and stuff like that. And, what a slow, terrible way for 2 million people to die. Yeah. And so I guess, if you see your role in it as being the one that goes out and takes the bullet that wakes people up, then maybe that's what you got to do.
It's it sounds like, you hate to say it, and I hate that it's this way, but it sounds almost as if, they'll get what's coming to them eventually. You see it in the French Revolution, like there was a lot of terribleness, but, when people are forced into desperation, they do desperate things and terrible things. And so I just don't, it can't end well the way it's going now. So I don't know if there's someone who can galvanize and really lead out of this situation because it's so tangled. But, I really hope that that's not the case and that they can work their way out of it because it's going to be terrible.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Kyle.
I was just going to say, I kind of had some hope with Donald Trump just because he seems so anti-establishment that maybe he wouldn't have all the, because the consensus is that Israel is America's greatest ally. It's our outpost in the Middle East. It's the bastion of freedom and democracy in the Middle East, even though half the people there aren't allowed to vote. But forget all that. And, we need Israel, and Israel is so important to us. And maybe Donald Trump would be, sit down with his generals on the first day and they would explain the situation to him. And he would go, what? No, this is ridiculous. But of course that didn't happen. And he has, moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He's appointed an ambassador to Israel that is even more hawkish than Netanyahu on the issues, to be honest there. And, he hasn't been good on the issue. So it is hard to see any kind of resolution or this moving into a positive direction.
So Trump and I don't know about Trump specifically, but American politicians in general say that there's a link between Iran and Hamas. Is there any truth to that? And if so, does it matter?
I don't know how much it matters. The policy was first Saddam's and now Iran's, but that's basically to pay the people of Gaza, or not of Gaza, the Palestinian people, kind of like money for their losses. So let's say you're a Palestinian family and your son goes out and gets killed in a protest or whatever, even if it's fighting for Hamas. Iran will send your family some money. Now, they say that's financing for Hamas and that's support of Hamas. And I kind of see the point there. But at the same time, you had to understand that the situation in Israel is this. You need a permit to work. You need a house to live in. And the Israeli government, if any member of your family is found fighting for Hamas, oftentimes your home gets bulldozed or taken from you and you lose your permit to work. And so if you're somebody that has a family to support, that means through no fault of anybody else in your family, maybe everybody else is a completely, non-violent, innocent person. If one person decides to go out and even if they don't commit violence, they just are labeled a member of Hamas, suddenly your family's home is destroyed and you're out of work. You need that money to survive, quite literally. And so a lot of times those grievance payments are the only things that keep people alive. And so it's definitely more complicated than Iran funds Hamas.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like there's no due process whatsoever, but we can't be surprised when our president doesn't even understand what that means. And so why would he care?
None of our presidents.
Yeah, none of them really understand it. But you have one that, absolutely says, well, someone shouldn't have due process. It's a crazy state of, these people. I hate to generalize because I know some, politicians, and, on the whole, they seem like pretty decent people. But, when they go to Washington, it changes them. And it's almost like they become psychopaths. Like the people of the world don't count anymore as people. They're numbers, and they're players on a board. And it's disturbing to think that, that people that we can live in our communities can view other humans like that, and as if, it really doesn't matter. Like Madeleine Albright, 500,000 dead Iraqi children, it was worth it. It's so they can't even comprehend that those are actual people and they're actually suffering, and those families, they don't just hate us for our freedom, they hate us because we're killing them and murdering their children. So it just doesn't seem like that's something that's really computing with the United States government ever. I don't know when I can imagine that it's ever really computed with people, because even Obama's administration drone bombed a wedding of 200 people because they thought one guy they don't like was there. So they're no better than anyone else. And he can take his Peace Prize with him to the pit of hell or whatever, because that's, if there was one, that's where he would be along with the rest of them. So I don't know, did you have any more on Israel, or should we move on to a little, gosh, it's so depressing.
I was just thinking that I did have some other questions about general foreign policy, but we are coming up on the hour now.
Yeah.
Actually, I do have Israel-specific versions of these questions, though. So maybe just one or two of those. Okay. So, Kyle, what do you think are, say, the two biggest organizations or entities that put pressure to bear on the U.S. government to do so much for Israel? I'm guessing, so like the military-industrial complex, obviously, selling weapons would be a big one. Seems like an obvious one. The Jewish lobby, but I don't really know anything about them. But
evangelical Christians, maybe? Or?
I would probably say it would be, the military-industrial complex would be number one. F-35s are expensive. The missiles they fire are expensive, and Israel buys a lot of them and has a lot of money to do it. $3.6 billion of which every year is straight from the American taxpayer, while Israelis have universal health care and universal college education, of course. The other one, the Republican Party may be a good place to start, just because Sheldon Adelson is very pro-Israel, very anti-Palestinian, and he throws a lot of money at the Trump campaign. I certainly think he's behind John Bolton now being in the White House. I saw a tweet yesterday saying that John Bolton was going to meet with the Israeli National Security Advisor. I was confused because I thought that was John Bolton's job, but it's just, it's hard to say. Republican Party, there's a lot of think tank consensus, but the rest of it, it's just, kind of an overall consensus that, Israel is our good ally and everybody needs to support them. And, it certainly doesn't help that people who say, these kind of things sometimes get called a Nazi. And it, for a long time, it did keep me silent on the issue, even though I, was starting to feel very, very strongly that the Palestinians were the victims of the Israelis. It really took me getting into it and understanding the whole subject before I was willing to say anything publicly on the issue, just because it's like, if you miss one detail, if I explain one little thing wrong, you're a Nazi propagandist. You're spreading Nazi propaganda. Mm. That is propaganda that Nazis spread, and now you're spreading it. And it's like, okay, I just laid out this whole case right now, explaining how, these poor Palestinians are suffering, people who, are living in deprivation and slowly dying. And okay, maybe I misspoke on one little thing, but now I'm a Nazi because I'm standing up for poor dying people.
Right.
But that's the way it's often portrayed. And so I think has a very, very powerful influence as well. And
that I just want to point out is probably more often from people on the right than on the left, because, I know a lot of the right, they complain often that, well, whatever, if you say anything, you're a racist to the left. And that's true, but they have their own way of doing the same thing, like calling you a Nazi because you don't support everything that the state of Israel does. It's a pretty terrible state of affairs to be in.
It seemed like candidate Trump had pretty good instincts when it came to foreign intervention.
Not wanting to bomb Syria.
Yeah, but now President Trump is obviously not quite the same. What do you think happened?
I mean, I think there's a few possibilities. One is that Trump was just saying whatever and people cheered, and so he said it more often. Certainly, if you look at, his lock her up chants at his rallies, and pretty much immediately after winning the presidency, he said, I'm not going to do that. So, I mean, he may have just been blustering the whole time and never was serious about anything he advocated for. Part of me thinks that he probably just didn't know a whole lot on it. And so, like, he was going out his campaign rallies and saying things and people were cheering. And then once he got into office, they put all these people in front of him and they said, this is the expert on this is the expert on that. And he said, okay, yeah, sure. Israel's very important. And they could come up with all these catastrophes. I mean, watch Fox News, and you could very easily get yourself scared of Iran or North Korea or the Iraqis or the Taliban or whoever the hell else, just by watching that kind of thing. And I'm sure whatever people are able to put in front of them, and my guess is that Trump doesn't sit down and read like Andrew Bacevich's book, War for the Greater Middle East, and kind of examine what the history is here and everything like that. And he just listens to what people tell him. And so when John Bolton tells him that, hey, if you don't take this action, then Israeli people will die, U.S. soldiers will die, it'll put the U.S. at risk, North Korea will get a nuclear weapon. I'm sure Trump, just kind of gets scared like everybody else and says, okay, we got to do what we got to do then.
Yeah.
Well, on that bright note, we are coming up on the end of the hour. So I just wanted to give you a moment to give any links to any, of your websites, to your podcast. It's been really informative talking to you, and I appreciate you coming on. I definitely would like to learn more, so I'll check out those resources. And any other resources, any books that you recommend. I know Fool's Errand by Scott Horton is an amazing book, which I have read, but if you have any other suggestions, we'd love to have those as well.
Yeah, so check out immersionnews.com. It's my news website, and if you're wondering where I'm getting all my information from, some people ask me that sometimes, check that out. I've linked to pretty much everything. All the articles that I talk about on my show and I've talked about here are probably linked to on immersionnews.com. Libertarianinstitute.org, you can find my podcast, and I put out a daily news roundup there. And then my show is Foreign Policy Focus. It's on iTunes and everywhere else. And then, let's see, books. War for the Greater Middle East, that I just mentioned by Colonel, sorry, I hope I didn't say General before, Andrew Bacevich, is a very good book. War at the Top of the World by Eric Margulies is a very good book that I'm working my way through on India, Pakistan, and China, kind of explaining, what's going on there. And if there's a nuclear hotspot in the world, it may not be North Korea and the United States. It may actually be there. There's, contestant fighting going on, nuclear weapon states there. The other one I'll recommend is a little bit different. It's called Hooper's War by Peter Van Buren. And it looks at moral injury and how basically putting people in the positions that war puts them in causes what he calls moral injury. And that's just like this huge injury to like what makes us human. I mean, like, what conscious soul, whatever you want to call it. And I really think it's a brilliant book as to like how war scars so deeply.
Yeah.
I want to give you a quick kudos for Immersion News, because when I went on the website today, I saw that map of the world, and I thought it was just a static graphic, and I was like, wow, that's kind of weird and just oddly placed. And then my mouse pointer accidentally went on top of it, and everything started lighting up. I was like, oh, wow, you can just pick a country and see what the news is for that country. That is fantastic. Yeah,
hence the immersion. You can really get in there. Well, Kyle, we sure appreciate you coming on and giving us such great answers on a really difficult subject that I know it's a mess, and it's hard to kind of know all of those things. So I really appreciate you, what you do and helping me to understand that a little better and giving some resources. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on your show. I really appreciate it.
Great. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.